I see her. She saw me. She knows that I see her. She drops me her glance, but just at an angle where it is still possible to act as though it was not addressed to me. And at the end, the real glance, straight forward, that lasted a 24th of a second, the length of a film frame.
Chris Marker, not exactly a household name among photographers, yet throughout his career he did work that was important to photography. It wasn't traditional, and it's certainly not easy, but it was definitely interesting. His most famous work, La Jetée, is a science fiction film made up entirely of still photographs, and as such, it's a film that foregrounds the still image set in a particular sequence with a specific timing as the essence of the cinema. And this is a little strange because it's exactly what motion pictures need us to forget if we want to be immersed in the cinematic illusion. Now, a book version of that film was produced in 1992, and because of the nature of the film, it's important to keep in mind that the book isn't stills from the film, it's actually the film in book form. And in the book, one can linger on or breeze by each image in whatever time one likes, in whatever order one likes. So the film and the book can be used to create totally different experiences of what is essentially the same material. And I take this to be a singular experience in the visual arts. Now, as La Jetée suggests, Marker didn't stay within traditionals and genres exactly. His work included films, photography, books, a CD-ROM, and it also included a presence on the website Second Life, and yeah, even a YouTube channel. And as in La Jetée, where he created a motion picture from still photographs, he also worked in the other direction, creating still photographs by pulling images from motion pictures and videos. And this is what he did for his expansive 2007 exhibit and monograph titled Staring Back, which is comprised of images created between 1952 and 2006. As Marker himself described it, these are not bona fide photographs. They're stills from my video footage, somewhat manipulated through the juju craft of Photoshop and Painter. It's an experiment I conducted for years in order to extract meaningful images from the inordinate flow of video and television. I developed the concept of the superliminal, which is a sort of counterpoint to subliminal. Instead of one frame lost in the stream of other different frames, superliminal is one frame lost in the stream of almost identical frames, or so it seems when you take them one by one. One happens to be the real photogram, something nobody then has perceived, not even the guy who shot it, me in most cases. Now this is so interesting because it's Marker describing the way he works within the cinematic idea of the take or the shot, while at the same time asserting that each take has a single essence that can't be perceived until it's isolated as a still image, what he called the photogram. This idea bridges the cinematic and the photographic, complicating a conceptual distinction that has been well established for a long time. But this complication could really be difficult for photographers to accept, as it runs directly afoul of deeply entrenched beliefs about what photography is, such as Cartier-Bresson's notion of the decisive moment, which posits the photographer's job as marrying timing and compositional rigor. Cartier-Bresson put it this way: "To me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event as well as of precise organization of forms, which gives that event its proper expression." Cartier-Bresson and Marker both emphasize recognizing the essence of the image, but Cartier-Bresson's statement suggests, and is often interpreted as meaning, that to be a photographer is discovering the essence of a moment in real time as it happens, whereas Marker believes the essence can only be discovered after the fact. Cartier-Bresson thinks in terms of formalism, right? I mean, the moment isn't a moment without intentional organization of line, shape, tone, and space. The frame's required because it organizes forms into what he thought of as a proper image. Now, Marker, on the other hand, is different. He didn't seem to really care about form. The essence he seeks is relational. It's about the interaction between people and finding an image of that interaction that captures its essence. Thus, if you think about it, all of the photographs in Staring Back are discoveries. They weren't created with the kind of intentionality that most photographers believe is required to make an image a photograph. Marker is present in the moment, but that's only the beginning. He writes, "I stare at them, but not enough, not long enough." There's a beautiful poem by Valéry Larbot who evokes 4 young women he caught a glimpse of during his journeys, and he laments not being able to reach them now. "For I don't know why, it seems to me that with them I could conquer a world." There is something of the megalomaniac melancholy in the browsing of past images. Perhaps if I could catch up with that absolute beauty in Cape Verde, the violinist in Stockholm lost in her thoughts, the grandmother in Corsica kissing the sacred stones, the exhausted Chinese laborer, the Japanese extra sleeping between takes, the 2 Russian girls listening to poetry, the young woman dozing on the train, and the old man with his paper toys, perhaps I could conquer a world, or rather, they would conquer a world for me. So Marker is collecting images over time, considering the people in them and assembling what's not exactly a future, but a fantasy about what could be. Marker was very much an activist, and so I think he comes by this kind of fantasy naturally. And in that way, he's really something of a latter-day Walt Whitman, celebrating the diversity of common people and longing to be unified with them through the devices of the camera and his own empowered gaze. Another reason that photographers might have difficulty with Marker is technical in nature. Marker really seemed barely aware of technical issues. He didn't use specific technologies for their formal characteristics for how the image looked. He used different technologies because of how they served his purposes. For example, he stated one time, "I came to the conclusion that the only sensible weapon against the cops could be a film camera." So he was thinking about how to confront state power being used against the citizenry, but that didn't pull him in any specific aesthetic direction. He didn't desire to create images that looked a certain way. He wanted to use images to confront the brutality of the police. Thus, he used whatever means were available to him in a given era. And because of this, really technically oriented photographers might feel that his images are sloppy or crude or antiquated. I mean, consider an image like this of filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. It's so pixelated that the details of his face appear as if seen through a thick, irregular glass. In this image, the woman's hair is reduced to low-res lines and points. The crude smoothing done on her face in the background in Photoshop stands out against the more contrasty pixelation in other areas of the image. To be sure, there's a difference between the lo-fi images of Marker and someone like, say, Sally Mann, whose application of older, imprecise methods became part of her aesthetic, adding a distance and a mystery to her images. I mean, to be honest, there's no mystery with Marker's work. Any of us who've ever used Photoshop know exactly how he used it and maybe even overused it. His editing doesn't really make the images more clear or legible as one might expect. It just leaves evidence that they were edited. It's a trace of activity added to the images. And this is uncomfortable, right? I mean, technical precision is so closely equated with photographic and artistic excellence that many of us are going to have trouble knowing what to do with work that looks like this. It raises questions about intention and technical proficiency, aesthetics, what counts as art and what counts as photography. And really, in short, it's the difference between formalism and conceptualism. So, a couple points. First, staring back is organized around the idea of the gaze. Now, today when we think of the gaze, of course, we think about the male gaze or the colonial gaze, and those ideas do matter here. Clearly, Marker didn't just magically transcend his cultural context. His gaze was gendered, and he was a product of colonial power structures, even as he had a critical awareness of them. But we should also acknowledge that when Marker himself talked about the gaze, he was getting at the idea that if one person looks at another, it's an invitation for someone to look back. And that's what he was interested in. His narrative is organized around this dynamic. For him, there was a kind of collaboration, a deep truth in the act of looking, of strangers acknowledging each other. And yeah, this for sure has its problems, but at least he acknowledged when it didn't work the way he expected it to. Also, I think it's okay to say that the images in staring back might not work individually, that they need to be considered collectively in relation to one another for the patterns to become evident. Looking at just one or two of these images, some people are going to be left with the impression that they're just seeing the work of a distracted amateur. But taken collectively, ideas start to emerge. In the photographs of protests, Marker does get the police with their neckties and batons. He captures people yelling and running and marching, but you know, he doesn't quite do it journalistically. Few of these images would be at home in the daily news. He also captures different types of moments. He captures moments of stillness, of listening, of waiting, even boredom. These aren't images intended to summarize a general point about political unrest or angry crowds. They are about the individuals that make up the crowds. So he didn't produce propaganda or journalism because he was always more interested in the individuals as such, their emotional experiences, and how they occupied the space of the street. He writes, "As my lens slips inside the crowd like an inquisitive snake, which it frames is, despite the apparent cohesiveness of the group, the everlasting face of solitude." So, moving within the crowd, he rolls his camera and he captures the images that are going to later become the photograms. And in many cases, the results look a lot like a snapshot. And this might be an important reason why we need Marker or photographers like him. Because if we left humanitarian crises, famine, political tumult, and protest to the usual names of great photographers, you know, Salgado, Cartier-Bresson, Koudelka, McCullin, then we have a specific problem. And that is that the whole scope of human experience, from the tragic to the everyday, is in most cases an aesthetic matter. The images tend to be beautiful before they're anything else, and because of that, I would suggest that they keep the world and the people in it at a certain distance. And you know, over the years, there have been more and more questions raised about the beautification of human suffering. Now, Marker, on the other hand, turns out to have been the predecessor for the most important images being created in the world today, such as Darnella Frazier's cell phone video of George Floyd's murder. Her video and the stills pulled from it operate just as markers did. It didn't matter at all what kind of camera she used or what her aesthetics were. I mean, it would be bizarre to ask, right? She used the tool she had in hand to confront the brutality of the police. And her video is relational in nature, not really formal. She created, an 11-minute long video from which a photographic essence was extracted. And this is the photogram from the video, and it circulated around the world. The physically unimpressive cop, the fingers of his left hand resting on his thigh, his face calm. He's almost relaxed, kneeling on Floyd's neck. Murder has never seemed so nonchalant. The image describes the relationship between two human beings and the extreme callousness of one man towards another. It brings to life our worst fears about the relationship between the police and those who are policed, between white and black, between those with power and those without it. We are always going to admire and respect well-crafted images, but at this point in history, it should be obvious that formal excellence isn't necessary for the image to do its job. And in the wrong hands, formalism turns out to be little more than an empty aesthetic gesture. Images that confront power, that describe the relationship between individuals, that bring us closer to the world they describe, we will always have a desperate need for images that can do that, no matter how they're created.